The proposed £90,000 top-up for Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor's overseas travel wasn't just a footnote in government records. It pointed to a deeper pattern. During his time as trade envoy, Andrew traveled extensively through Southeast Asia, Russia, and the Middle East, often staying in luxury hotels and sparking long-standing rumors of questionable spending and personal behavior. His trip to Thailand, for instance, has repeatedly come up in stories involving escorts and extravagance.
If you love getting the real story behind the palace walls, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell so you never miss an update.
When those same archives started to leak redacted documents, the public's worst suspicions found new fuel. What might have passed as bureaucratic reshuffling now looks more like an intentional effort to bury uncomfortable truths. In Andrew's case, the fusion of personal indulgence with public funding raises not just ethical concerns, but a glaring conflict between diplomatic duty and private pleasure. The £90,000 isn't just about logistics. It's about whether accountability still matters once a royal signature is on the... They were supposed to be just another round of government file releases, dry, procedural, and buried in the back pages of the National Archives. But the second Prince Andrew's name came up, things got weird. Documents that were previously listed suddenly vanished. Others were redacted without warning. And the timing? Right when journalists were starting to ask questions about a curious £90,000 request linked to Andrew's international trips during his stint as a UK trade envoy. That amount wasn't part of a routine travel budget. It was flagged for extra funding. Extra funding, on top of already questionable expenses. This wasn't a minor accounting hiccup. It cracked open a door that the royal family had been trying to keep sealed shut for years. And once you're reminded of Andrew's travel record, Thailand, Kazakhstan, Libya, the question becomes less about why he needed the money and more about what those trips were really funding. Because behind the government jargon and red tape is the reality that Andrew's international conduct wasn't just expensive. It was diplomatically risky, reputationally dangerous, and now legally sensitive. The shadow of Jeffrey Epstein has never fully lifted from Prince Andrew's public image. And with this new wave of scrutiny, that shadow has only grown darker. Even before the infamous BBC interview, long before he stepped away from public duties, whispers about Andrew's lifestyle abroad followed him like a storm cloud. Now, we're seeing how much effort has gone into keeping some of those stories quiet.
If you love getting the real story behind the palace walls, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell so you never miss an update.
Legal exemptions were used to block access to specific files. References to certain meetings and expenses were removed or withheld under sections of the Freedom of Information Act that protect royal correspondence. The overlap between redacted documents and Andrew's travel destinations isn't subtle. The same places where his associations were most controversial, like trips to Thailand, where reports of luxury hotels and escort services had circulated for years, are the same places journalists can't seem to get a straight record on. The more you connect the dots, the more it looks like a calculated effort to minimize exposure to anything that could validate those allegations, especially when you factor in the diplomatic cables and leaked memos that have trickled out over the years, documenting everything from inappropriate jokes to troubling associations. For the wider royal family, this isn't just about Andrew anymore. It's about control, controlling the narrative, controlling the optics, and, if possible, controlling the fallout. Because every time a scandal linked to Andrew resurfaces, it drags the monarchy back into the public microscope. And this time, it wasn't a tabloid hit job or an unverified rumor. It was government records, official documents, that were being selectively removed from public view. That doesn't just spark outrage. It sparks suspicion. What else is buried in those archives? What other line items were padded with unexplained expenses or vague justifications? The £90,000 is a flashpoint, but the real issue is that it points to a broader pattern. One where royal privilege shields certain actions from scrutiny, even when public money is involved. And in an age where accountability is demanded from every other public figure, that kind of secrecy is becoming harder to justify. Buckingham Palace hasn't exactly rushed to clarify the situation. In fact, silence seems to be the strategy of choice. But behind closed doors, there's no way this isn't causing panic. Because redacted files don't make stories disappear, they make them louder. When reporters realized that Andrew's documents were being held back under Section 37 protections, which relate specifically to communications with the royal household, it confirmed what many had suspected. This wasn't about national security or diplomatic risk. It was about protecting the monarchy from embarrassment. The palace has faced media storms before, but Andrew is different. His scandals come with legal weight and international headlines. The decision to obscure files only adds fuel to the fire. If the contents of those pages were harmless, there'd be no reason to hide them. And if they weren't, then the royal family has a much bigger problem than just bad PR. The Epstein connection continues to haunt everything related to Prince Andrew. Even if these redacted documents don't mention Epstein directly, the context is impossible to ignore. After all, some of Andrew's most notorious overseas visits occurred during the height of his relationship with Epstein. Business trips blurred with personal excursions. Official duties overlapped with private indulgences. And through it all, the people around him seemed willing to look the other way. What's especially damaging is the pattern. Time and time again, Andrew placed himself in the orbit of individuals with questionable reputations, sometimes linked to authoritarian regimes, sometimes to wealth and influence, and in Epstein's case, both. And now, years later, the cost of those choices is being paid in the form of redacted files, legal loopholes, and a legacy that may never recover. There's no escaping the implications. The same prince who once offended his friendship with Epstein on national television is now at the center of yet another secrecy scandal. Virginia Giuffre's allegations against Andrew changed everything. They took what had previously been seen as bad optics or poor judgment and turned it into something far more serious. Even though a legal settlement was eventually reached, the damage to Andrew's reputation was irreversible. And it's in that context that these newly redacted documents take on even more weight. Because they are not just about travel expenses or diplomatic duties. They are about a history of behavior that the public has every reason to question. The fact that legal protections are still being used to block access to Andrew's activities during this period only reinforces a perception that there's something to hide. It's not just journalists raising eyebrows. Legal experts, historians, and members of Parliament have all expressed concern about the precedent this sets. If the royal family can block the release of government documents related to public roles, what else can they? King Charles inherited more than just a crown. He inherited a crisis. And as reigning monarch, any scandal involving senior royals now falls squarely in his lap. Charles has tried to draw a line between the monarchy of the past and the streamlined, modern institution he claims to be building. But Andrew is a living reminder of that old world, the one where connections matter more than accountability, and personal discretion were protected at all costs. So when documents are suddenly redacted under royal exemptions, it doesn't just reflect on Andrew. It reflects on the institution as a whole, and by extension, on Charles. The challenge now is whether he can maintain credibility while overseeing a system that still appears to operate under different rules for royals. And with public trust in the monarchy already under pressure, the stakes couldn't be higher. Then there's the matter of Royal Lodge, Andrew's longtime residence and a symbol of the privileges he continued to enjoy despite being stripped of public duties. The optics of a disgraced prince living in a taxpayer-subsidized mansion have never sat well with the public. And now, with questions swirling about his overseas expenses and financial arrangements, it casts a harsh light on every asset, every allowance, every perk is managed to retain. It's not just about where he lives. It's about what it represents. The idea that accountability stops at the palace gates. But the redactions, the dodged questions, the silence from the palace, they all suggest the royal family is still betting on this blowing over. That with enough time, people will forget about the £90,000, or the travel logs, or the files that never got released. But they won't. Because in the age of digital archives and global news, hidden truths have a way of resurfacing when you least expect them. When Andrew was first appointed as a UK trade envoy, the goal was straightforward: leverage royal prestige to boost British business abroad. But over the years, that title became a loophole, a diplomatic badge that let him travel freely, often at public expense, while mixing official meetings with questionable company. The role came with access, immunity, and, as it turns out, a vague financial trail. No one's really been able to pin down how much he cost the taxpayer during that period, and the £90,000 just adds to fog. The redacted file suggests there's more behind the curtain, perhaps meetings that didn't make it into official logs or travel details that would raise more questions than answers. If the prince's job was to represent British interests, it's fair to ask whether those interests were ever truly being served, or whether his personal agenda was always running quietly in the background. The fallout from Andrew's association with Epstein didn't end with a BBC interview or the legal settlement. Every new revelation about his past activities reopens old wounds, not just for his victims, but for the royal institution that allowed this behavior to fester unchecked. The secrecy around his envoy years isn't just frustrating, it's telling. It hints at a pattern of insulation, of decision-makers around Andrew who either failed to intervene or actively helped shield him from scrutiny. Those redacted government records, they aren't just administrative choices. They are part of the long, slow effort to manage Andrew's image, an effort that failed spectacularly once Epstein's name entered the conversation. If even a fraction of those files touch on inappropriate behavior, it raises serious questions about what officials knew and how long they kept quiet. The Epstein scandal might have been the tipping point, but these new redactions show that the cover-up didn't stop there. In many ways, the monarchy is built on a delicate illusion, the idea that its members operate above scandal, that tradition and duty shield them from ordinary scrutiny. But every controversy chips away at that illusion, and Andrew's actions have been more damaging than most. The royal family's reluctance to confront this head-on has only made things worse. Instead of a public reckoning, there's been a pattern of silence, delay, and now censorship of documents that the public has every right to see. It's not just about Andrew and Amor. It's about how far the royal household will go to protect its own. When documents vanish or are redacted without clear justification, it becomes a matter of public trust. People aren't asking for gossip, they're asking for transparency. And when the institution continues to prioritize reputation over honesty, the consequences go far beyond bad press. They eat away at the legitimacy of the entire monarchy. No royal scandal in recent memory has been as toxic as Andrew's link to Epstein. It's not just the photos or the friendship or the disastrous TV interview. It's a credibility vacuum it created. Any attempt to rehabilitate Andrew's image was crushed under the weight of that connection. And now, as more documents relating to his public role get swept under legal exemptions, the Epstein cloud looms even larger. Even when the files aren't explicitly about Epstein, his presence lingers in the background. The years overlap. The trips coincide. And in diplomatic circles, the prince's reputation took a serious hit, long before the general public caught on. Officials from other countries were aware. Business people kept their distance. Behind the scenes, people were talking, even if the palace wasn't. The newly withheld documents raised the possibility that someone, somewhere in the UK government, tried to raise alarms, and those alarms were ignored or suppressed. Back at the palace, it's damage control as usual. But that strategy isn't working anymore. With each new story, with each set of redacted pages, the optics grow worse. The refusal to explain why files were withheld only intensifies public frustration. And let's be honest, when a £90,000 request surfaces in the middle of all this, people aren't going to assume it's innocent. They're going to assume it's connected to something the royal family doesn't want them to see. In the past, palace silence could be chalked up to dignity or tradition. Now, it just looks like evasion. The public isn't looking for scandal, they are looking for answers. And the longer those answers are delayed, the more suspicious everything starts to feel. At this point, the royal family isn't protecting Andrew, they are risking the credibility of the crown itself. The public first heard Virginia Giuffre's story years ago, but with every fresh controversy involving Andrew, her account gains new relevance. She wasn't just alleging a private encounter, she was pointing to a systemic failure of oversight, one that allowed a royal to move through elite circles without accountability. Now, with these travel documents being hidden or censored, it feels like that system is still in place. There's a pattern here: allegations, denials, and then silence. Files disappear, questions go unanswered, and each time, the public is expected to move on. But Giuffre's case proved that silence doesn't erase the facts. It delays them. And when those facts finally do surface, whether in court, in the press, or through leaked files, they hit even harder. The decision to redact these government documents may have bought time, but it also reinforces a very suspicion that keeps this scandal alive. For King Charles, this is a stress test of leadership. He has already tried to position himself as a reformer, a modernizer who's willing to slim down the monarchy and focus on service over spectacle. But Andrew is a contradiction he can't shake. No matter how far Charles tries to move forward, his brother pulls the family back into the past, into secrecy, into scandal. What Charles does next matters, because shielding Andrew, or allowing government agencies to do it for him, sends a clear message. Some royals are still above accountability. That message doesn't just hurt the crown's image, it undermines its future. In an era where transparency is expected from every public institution, the monarchy can't afford to be the exception, especially not with Andrew still occupying royal property, living under royal protection, and now, at the center of another storm. Royal Lodge isn't just a home, it's a symbol. It's a reminder that even after being stripped of titles, Andrew's lifestyle remains untouched. He doesn't make public appearances, but he hasn't exactly faded from public life either. He's still there, still funded, still protected. And now, with this £90,000 travel budget exposure, people are starting to question how much more is being spent and how much is being hidden. The redacted files, the redirection of questions, the sudden legal blocks, it all paints a picture of a man whose royal privilege still buys him distance from consequence. And while the public has to accept austerity and scrutiny, Andrew remains insulated. That contrast is jarring. It's not just about what's fair. It's about what's right. And as long as the palace refuses to be transparent, the public will keep pushing for answers. Because the truth is a way of getting out, no matter how tightly it's sealed. It's not hard to understand why the £90,000 funding issue has hit such a nerve. This isn't a vague figure hidden in a complex budget. It's a clear, concrete number tied directly to one man's travels, and that man just happens to be one of the most controversial royals of our time. The public isn't questioning whether Prince Andrew flew first class or stayed at a decent hotel. They are questioning why government funds were being shuffled around quietly to cover his international jaunts at a time when his behavior was already under scrutiny. The redacted files don't help. If anything, they make it worse, because when information disappears without explanation, the assumption becomes, there's something in there that we weren't supposed to see. Something about where he went, who he met, or how the money was spent that could embarrass not just Andrew, but the entire royal apparatus that enabled it. By now, the public has seen enough to know that Andrew doesn't operate in a vacuum. His missteps are often propped up by a network of silence, soft diplomacy, and royal deference. What makes this £90,000 scandal particularly volatile is that it doesn't just reflect his choices. It reflects on the system that allowed those choices to continue even after red flags were flying everywhere. This isn't just about private behavior bleeding into public duties. It's about the institutions that saw those blurred lines and chose to look away. When someone with Epstein connections is traveling on the public dime, using diplomatic cover to move through foreign territories, it demands more than vague redactions and polite no comments. It demands real answers. And so far, the silence has only raised the stakes. The idea that Andrew still poses a threat to the monarchy's credibility isn't some fringe opinion. It's now an institutional concern. Every time a document is shielded from public view, it reaffirms a perception that the palace is still cleaning up after him. There's been no decisive break, no full distancing. And while he may be sidelined from formal duties, there's an undeniable sense that the royal family still hasn't fully reckoned with the extent of the damage. This is where the tension lives, between the image of a modernizing monarchy and the reality of unresolved scandal. Andrew was supposed to fade into the background, a royal relic best forgotten. But the news cycle keeps pulling him back into focus, reminding everyone that the consequences of unchecked privilege don't just vanish when titles are dropped. They leave a trail, one that, in this case, includes government documents, financial transfers, and a whole lot of unanswered questions. You'd think, after everything, that the palace would want to get ahead of the story, release the documents, clear the air, offer transparency before speculation takes over. But that's not what happened. Instead, reporters were met with locked doors and legal exemptions, redacted pages where context should have been, Carefully chosen phrases like national interest or royal household protections, bureaucratic shields that only added to the suspicion. The longer the palace stays quiet, the more damaging it becomes. The royal family want to be seen as modern and open, but when it comes to Andrew, they keep reverting to old instincts. Protect, delay, obscure. And that approach is running out of room. People aren't just watching, they're remembering. Remembering the interviews, the headlines, the payouts, and now the latest trail of redactions. It's a storm they can't PR their way out of. Every time this story resurfaces, it exposes another layer that someone tried to bury. First it was photos, then it was interviews. Now, it's the blacked-out files and suspiciously timed redactions. But here's the thing, no amount of secrecy can compete with public memory. People remember what was said, what wasn't said, and now they are watching to see if accountability will finally catch up to royalty. If you're here for the full story, the ones they don't want you to know, make sure you're subscribed. Hit the like button, share this with someone who still thinks this will all go away quietly, and drop your thought below. What do you think's in those files? Because something tells me this isn't over, not by a long shot.